Wednesday. We are live here with Briana Villegas, who is going to be taking us down the road of menstruation. I know many of us were never introduced to what even, what is it even called the first time you ever bleed? I think I was doing my women's studies at Long Beach State when I was sitting in a class, Women and Their Bodies, and she said, what do you call your first period? And I thought, like, what in the world could you have ever called it the first of anything outside of what it is? And so, menarche.
Yeah.
Yeah, menarche, that's the first time I was a grown adult when I first heard that. So I want to invite Brianna to go ahead and introduce herself. Tell us a little bit about you. What got you fascinated into this world of period?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am trained as a menstrual cycle awareness coach, and that training was informed by polyvagal theory as well. So like very much a holistic view of like the cycle, the nervous system, the psychology of it, as well as being trauma informed. But I have started recently moving towards referring to myself as an integration coach because I think these lenses really inform my work, but I'm not like a protocol. I'm not a menstrual cycle protocol coach. So I'm not, putting people on plans or, diets or things like that or doing hormone testing. Because for me, like my entry into this world was through premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's also called PMDD. It's essentially like an adverse brain response to the normal fluctuations in hormones. So, how I experienced that was having 2 good weeks and then 2 really bad weeks. And it really presented kind of bipolar, where like the distinction was so different that during my follicular and ovulatory phase, which is the first half of like your, 28 ish day cycle, would feel really, really high, really like overachiever, motivated, could set my mind to anything and get it done. And then after I ovulated, I would just go into this deep depression, anxiety, like really struggled sometimes to get out of bed, to just like to take care of basic things. And that was from my first period. So I didn't ever have like before, these symptoms and then after. So I really internalized so much messaging around like must be something wrong with me and I must just not be handling this the way that other people are. And like my mom didn't have this. My mom had very relatively easy periods, so like I didn't see examples of it. So I was just like, "Oh, I must be the problem."
Mm-hmm.
And I think I kind of built that vision of my mom too as like, "Oh, look, she's so amazing. She can work out through her period. She can do all these things. Something's wrong with me." But I just found ways to cope with that because I didn't have the language at the time of like that this was cyclical. I just knew that at some point I would hit a wall and I had to overachieve, work ahead. Like in college, I would submit things early. I would always be like, the syllabus was like my best friend because I would work ahead because I knew I would hit a wall and then I would barely be able to, get the reading assignments or various things done. And then so I just kind of lived with that and just assumed like, well, this is womanhood, this is what you do. Like so many of us who deal with, even like whether it's physical pain or the emotional turmoil that comes with it. And it was really motherhood that gave me the sort of painful push to be like, this can't be my story and it can't be theirs. I think there was a big part of it that was like, this can't be how
Right,
they experience me. And
right.
so that was very strong with my first, who is a boy. I was like, they can't experience me this way. And then when I had my daughter second, it was a different type of wake up call of like, if this is the best information I have to give her, like that is not okay. And I will like almost regret bringing her into the world if she like has to go through the same thing that I did. And so I did all the research and all the sort of modern Western approach was like the pill, SSRIs, or medically induced menopause were the options. And I had been on the pill for a couple years and just knew, I was like, it didn't help at all. I don't know that it made it worse for me, but I was like, it definitely didn't help. And I just did not align with those options. There was just a part of me that's like, shutting this cycle off like isn't the answer. And I don't know how I knew that because I like hated my period. Like I wasn't like, oh, I love this. I was not attached in any way, but there was something inside me that was like, no, there's has to be something more. And that's when I kind of started to learn about cycle syncing and that we know that there's 4 distinct phases and how the hormones work. And I was just so blown away at all the information that I hadn't received. And then realizing, like, oh, I haven't received it because no one in my family, no one in my circle, no one knows this stuff. So it really was for me a process of, like, yes, working on, my health and self-care and understanding the cycle helped with some symptom relief. But for me, shifting from I'm managing my symptoms and it's still like the constant focus of my life is what day am I on? What day am I going to be on when this event happens? Can I show up for that? To I don't even track now. Like I'll like occasionally check in like, oh, I'm probably close. Like what day am I on? And like feeling really free of that was really learning to integrate all these different versions of myself because I had built such a coping system and disassociation really of self. Like this is my good self, this is the self I like, and this is the self I don't like. And so that's really informed my approach of like really the embodiment piece, because I think there's an element that's like, even if your symptoms go away, like, do you know how to relate to yourself? Do you know how to relate to a healthy version of you and a healthy version of ebb and flow? And I think so many of us don't have that layer of the conversation. And so that's really where my passion for it comes from and the work I do.
I'm really curious if you know what hormones were disrupting all of this for you. Was it a lot of progesterone? Not enough?
Yeah, so that's the fascinating thing about PMDD is it's not a hormone imbalance. So, and there's no specific test for it. So you can get tested to find out if your hormones are the levels that they're supposed to be. But the main criteria, because it's like in the DSM, so it's considered a mood disorder more so than, it's like a hormone related mood disorder is how it's categorized. And so it isn't about the hormones being disrupted, it's how the brain and body are responding to them. So my theory on it is very much that it is a nervous system disorder. And it's because you're going through such big shifts, and so there's a lot of comorbidity with high sensitivity, neurodivergence, trauma, and the times that PMDD pops up, it can happen in puberty, but it's also postpartum, perimenopause, all these times when our brain is undergoing like huge rewiring. And so I think that it has much more to do with how our nervous system is processing these shifts. And that's again where that like integration piece of my work comes in, because it's like, like for someone who's neurodivergent, they may see that their sensory sensitivity gets much higher premenstrually than it is the rest of the month. And I noticed that with like, I have 3 young kids, I get much more sensitive to noise. And it can be happy playing noise, and it just is so different for me premenstrual than it is at other times of the month. So it is a very different experience than my estrogen's too high and I need to like, adjust that, or progesterone isn't high enough, and those conversations. But I think the parallel between that sort of emotional and nervous system experience and then the pain experience is that they're both these like chronic pain experiences that we then, it's like not only the pain of the thing, but then the anxiety about the pain coming and how we relate to that pain, how we relate to like, oh, it's coming. Because that's such a big thing with PMDD emotionally of like, oh no, like I felt the shift, the bad days are coming. And this happens too with heavy and painful periods where it's like, I know I'm getting close, the pain's coming. And when we get into that fight or flight response that increases inflammation, it can increase our perception of pain. And so there is still this parallel of like, how do I relate to this version of me that's experiencing pain, but also the version of me that's anticipating pain and that's wired to scan for it.
I love that. I love that because I do say that Hormonal imbalance is due to a dysregulated nervous system, and no one believes me.
Oh, yeah, no, that's where I stand on it as well. And that, I mean, it's obviously connected, right? So it's like whether it originates as physical symptoms first, that is going to influence your nervous system. Because a person who's chronically experiencing pain is
Right.
obviously going to have their nervous system, you know, trying to compensate for that, and how to cope in a modern world that doesn't create a lot of space for that experience. But also, if it is nervous system first, it's like that will eventually show up in your body.
Yeah, that's so wild. That's wild. Thank you. Thank you for explaining it because right, the first thing that I went to is this hormonal?
Yeah, and it's such a fascinating thing to be, you know, related in a lot of times. I think we're getting better in the diagnosis process, but it's one of those loops where often people go to their gynecologist because it's cycle related, and they're like, I gotta refer you to a psychologist because this isn't actually your hormones. And the psychologist will oftentimes be like, this is hormonal. And so people can kind of get caught in this loop of like no one quite knowing what to do with it. And yeah, I found that the nervous system work is really key in like integrating those pieces.
So let me ask you this other question. For many of us who experience painful periods, would you say that that is also activated by our nervous system? Like maybe what it was that we experienced throughout the first 3 weeks of the month of our cycle. If it was stressful, like is our body remembering all of this? Is there like a body memory that then gets expressed in pain?
Yeah, I think it can be. I mean, there's definitely physical components of it, like with endometriosis, where there's like it's an autoimmune response to the extra tissue in the body that then is exacerbated by estrogen. There can be fibroids and you know various like physical components that then is causing that pain. But I think with even within pain science, which I'm not an expert on, but what I do know about it is that there, when we anticipate it, when we're looking for it, when we know it's coming, we actually perceive it more intensely. And so much of the regulation with pain is being very much in the present moment. Because in the time leading up to it, returning to the present and being like, I'm safe right now. I'm not experiencing pain right now. And then in the moments of pain, coming back to like, can I hold the pain in this moment? Because I think what we also do is once the pain starts, we then start to ruminate, right? Of like, okay, this is going to get so much worse. It's going to go on for this many days. And that can also dysregulate our nervous system and amplify that experience and make it feel more overwhelming. And so there's obviously, you know, like do the things to support the pain as well, but that regulation in the moment is also going to be really valuable to like calm the nervous system so we're not amplifying what's already happening physically.
Interesting. Interesting. So I know you have a presentation for us, so please, you can share your screen. It's already set up for that.
All right, absolutely. All right, let me. Okay. Yeah, so the goal today is to really talk about this concept of embracing cyclical and to view our menstrual cycle as something that has more value than just achieving or preventing pregnancy. Because that's really the narrative I think that most of us, and the extent of education we got, not that it was much, even in that realm, but it was like, this is periods are about making babies or not making babies, and that's all that we have. And so it then becomes very easy to then go down the line of like, oh, well, if I don't want babies right now or ever, I could just eliminate this, right? Why do I need this? And so part of the conversation is going to be that why. Like, what is the value of this cycle beyond, you know, fertility? And the other thing that I want to point out here too is that I think a lot of times we kind of create a silo around this, right? We think about our period when we're on it, and then the rest of the time we try to avoid thinking about it, put any more time or attention into it. And sometimes there's even this concept of like, we're just putting in our time and we're powering through and we're counting down until menopause when like we'll be free of this, extra burden that we have to carry. But it is part of us. So even if you're not conscious of it, even if you're past reproductive years, even if you've done everything you can to shut it down, I truly believe that this cyclical rhythm is like in our DNA. It's how we're meant to move through the world. And I think that we can do things that make it harder to access that, like hormonal birth control, which does shut down ovulation and really flattens out the hormonal ebbs and flows. I think that really just makes it harder to access, but it doesn't really shut down that like cyclical energy and rhythm that we carry. And so we're gonna cover today some of the physical aspects, some of that education that we've been missing. And that really is going to center in on like the protective nature of the menstrual cycle and why it matters now, why it matters later. But then we're also gonna tap into more of the psychosomatic aspect of each of the phases and like how they can sort of be portals to our intuition, to our power, and how even if we're beyond reproductive years, that we can kind of go back to these places and these memories to reclaim parts of self that maybe we didn't get to appreciate in real time, but can serve us as we go through perimenopause and menopause. Because ultimately, I see all of these as like, these are feminine initiations, and the lessons that we pass through in our teenage years are not over and done. Like, we are going to be able to revisit those, but with like the wisdom of our life experience, and that can be such a valuable support in those maybe more, at least longer initiations that happen later in life. And so I want to start us here with this graph, just because I feel like so many people have no idea what our hormones do, or even what the concept of balance is. Because I know for me, balance very much has a connotation of everything being even and equal and linear and consistent. But this is actually a visual of like healthy, balanced hormones. And this is really what gives rise to the 4 phases that people talk about, because they're really bracketing these out as saying like, okay, in this section where progesterone and estrogen are really low, that's sort of one profile of reproductive hormones. And then we have another profile as estrogen is rising, and a 4th over ovulation when things are peaking. And then the 4th here is in luteal when progesterone and estrogen are present, but in a different relationship. And I think this helps to reframe what we, sorry, my mouse is all over the place, what we know about the cycle and how we appreciate it. Because another narrative that we've been given is that these reproductive hormones are basically isolated to our uterus and our ovaries. And that is not true. These hormones are interacting with every other system in your body. And estrogen is actually considered like the master regulator of the brain. And so estrogen has a lot to do with how you regulate your body temperature, how you sleep, your appetite. Like, it's talking to all these other systems. And this is why in perimenopause, when estrogen is in flux, we get the hot flashes and the sleep issues. It's because our body and our brains are learning how to relate to a different form of estrogen and how to regulate those parts of ourselves without that main source. And so when we're looking at this and this idea that it's communicating with our other systems, one thing that really helps me in understanding it, especially with like, we have a circadian rhythm, which is our 24-hour cycle as well. So these things are interacting with each other. And so on a daily basis, I think of the circadian rhythm as telling us when. When am I going to wake up? When am I going to get hungry? When am I going to get sleepy? Like, it's telling us when. It's also telling us when we're going to get stressed out. What are the consistent triggers that kind of set us off? And the hormonal cycle tells us how much. It's a more qualitative aspect. So it's saying like, okay, we probably are going to get sleepy at about the same time every night. but the amount of restorative sleep we need is going to vary based on where we are in our cycle. We're going to get hungry around the same time every day, but how high our caloric need is and what actually fuels and replenishes our body is going to vary based on where we are in our cycle. And so we're going to dive into those phases individually and talk a little bit more about that. But I also want to say here on the why question and really center on like why the cycle is protective. And the first thing is that the cycle is actually considered to be a vital sign. The association, I want to say pediatrics, like for teens, like especially the onset of their first period, the quality of their and the consistency, regularity, all those things are considered a vital sign for a girl's health. But this is and has been confirmed by like the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, like these other organizations have corroborated that this is such an important thing and marker of health, because it's often where we see dysfunction show up first. Because when we have regular cycles, right, like that's all, it's so intertwined with the other hormones and systems in our body. And often when something else isn't working, we'll see that first in ovulation stopping, or our periods getting shorter, getting longer, in pain increasing. Like all of those markers are signs that something is not working and functioning optimally in the body. And this isn't just for during the reproductive years, because there's a lot of talk about like balance your hormones and get everything, balanced during those years, but also the exposure to estrogen that we get cycle after cycle after cycle is actually creating preventative health for the perimenopause and menopausal years. And that's even, I'll show another graph later, but even initially in perimenopause, cycles tend to get shorter at first and estrogen tends to get higher. So we get more of an estrogen dominance effect. And it's thought that happens as a way to get some final extra like estrogen exposure before it fully drops off, because it is really helpful to prevent osteoporosis, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, like all of these things that come up as key, health issues in those later years is impacted by how much we've been cycling, essentially. And this is really the issue with birth control that I think most people don't have the full concept of, is that choosing to shut off that cycle, which is essentially shutting off ovulation. So not all birth controls are the same. Like a copper IUD does not shut off ovulation. And so, that's arguably, a better version of things, but obviously all of them have their pros and cons, and it depends on how you respond to it individually. But the pill especially does shut off ovulation, and in doing so shuts off our exposure to our naturally produced estrogen and progesterone. And the artificial versions of them they don't respond the same way in the body. And so we don't get the same long-term preventative benefit of that.
That's really interesting. I've never heard it be expressed that way. Pre-perimenopause or pre-hormone replacement therapy. I mean, I understand how efficient and how great it is to find a bioidentical. Do you think that they would create something bioidentical as a birth control?
I mean, I would love to see that science. I think is, the big answer. And then obviously we're in a moment in time, at least in the US for sure, where I am, that, a lot, we're fighting to hang on to the versions that we have, while also holding that, dichotomy of like, well, we still want this, but also it's not good enough. Like we need better science, we need more research, because the side effects and like how it's actually impacting the female body is not great. But also we're not saying take it away. It's like not
Right.
the answer, right?
Right, we want something much more natural that, I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to have a young woman be given bioidentical progesterone, for example, and how that would help her cycle to not get pregnant.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense in my head.
Yeah, and obviously that's the issue, right? The science on the reproductive hormones, female body and anatomy, and all of these things are just so far behind. So there are so many great questions to be asking, and that's why there is that other piece of like really being in relationship to your own body and your own cycle, so that you can make choices from that like intuitive, self-trust, empowered version of you, rather than being afraid of your body or afraid of what might happen, because obviously that's not, and we talked about that with like the pain and everything, like living in fear of how your body is going to respond or what might happen is not going to support your hormones and your nervous
Adds
system.
to the pressure.
And yeah, and with all of that said, like it's not to villainize birth control or HRT or any of those things, because also all of us come to this decision with different genetics, different lived experience, different environmental factors, different responsibilities and things we have to show up for. And so sometimes the choice to opt out of these things is a very privileged choice, to be able to adjust, your work hours, or, have the flexibility to do the self-care and things that would help support those transitions. And so I always want to name that, because it's just coming into it of knowing like what you need and what is really going to support you through the transition. And on the positive side, like we do have more science around it. We do have more studies than we've had in the past, and HRTs have had additional research done, and the quality of those has changed over the years. So I think it's not like all hope is lost if you've been on birth control for a long time, or if you're past the window to take advantage of the cycle. It's just knowing what you're coming into that, transition with, and, just making those empowered choices.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's jump into the specific phases. So menstrual phase, this is counted from day 1 of the bleed. And I would say and obviously like this can be from day 1 to the end of your bleed. But some people, if you're bleeding more like 7+ days, energetically and like what you're going to feel in your body, estrogen will start to rise before you fully finish bleeding. So I really consider this to be day 1 to 3, day 1 to 5, where you maybe fully feel in that maybe like lower energy, or like more internal cocoon type energy of the menstrual phase. And what is characteristic of this phase is that all the reproductive hormones are at their lowest. And I think about these hormones as internal buffers. So during this phase, those internal buffers that help us stay optimistic, stay resilient against stress, they're at their lowest. And so that means that the demands that are coming at us externally have a greater energetic cost. And this makes sense based on the hormones being low, but also your body's doing some pretty intense work during this phase. So it makes sense that it's like diverting energy to that process of shedding the uterine lining, and anything that is not like absolutely necessary is going to feel like an irritation, especially when it involves other people being able to do their own things, right? So we feel this a lot in motherhood. We can feel this a lot even at work, like if we're asked to do things that just feel like busy work, or like, you can handle this, you don't need me. Like, so this is where some of that irritation can come from, is that we're really doing a lot of internal work, and we don't have that same buffer against, just the demands of life. So we have this desire to sort of go inward, to cocoon, to be alone, to slow down. And we get in terms of stress and mood, it does make us more sensitive, right? And that, especially if then on top of that sort of energetic shift, you're also experiencing pain and discomfort, bloating, like those things, like obviously those are going to impact how you feel and how you interact with others. And the biggest things that we can do in this window of time is to replenish nutrients. So this is when the leafy greens, making sure we're getting enough iron, making sure that we're just like really supporting our body And like soups and stews are really great. I know that doesn't always, sometimes it's, I live in Phoenix. Sometimes it's so hot. We have hot summers, and it's like having soup in the, when it's 110, 115 outside is not always ideal. But what's great about soups for this is they're easy to digest. So thinking about that, like what foods are going to be easier for you to digest. So not so much like raw veggies and salads and things like that. Because that is, your body's just not going to be able to get the biggest impact out of that. That's why we want to like cook those things down some. And then the other thing is the physical rest. And I'm sure you've all heard like, oh, menstrual phase, you're supposed to rest and you're supposed to sleep. And so often this can feel like you're supposed to stop. And that feels so inaccessible because our jobs still go on, our kids still need things, our life keeps moving. And so I think much more important here than like having this like full stop, like spa day every month, which like if you can do it, great, like enjoy. But it really is about the pace. And I'll keep coming back to this. I've already said it already, but like with pace, it's about presence. It's about I'm right here, I'm doing this task, and I'm not spiraling about all the things I need to get to and how much energy that's going to take and if I'm going to be able to do it. And, like we create so much of this anxiety really about our capacity during this phase because we don't feel like we have the energy. So the more that we can just pace out what we need to do, that is going to create so much support for us, and that's going to help support our sleep and everything from there. And then when we shift into follicular phase, which begins around day 3 or 4 as estrogen starts to rise, but I will say follicular phase is a transition phase, meaning that you kind of need to feel into when that energy comes back online for you. Like that may vary, right, by individual, and it also can vary based on how much you've supported yourself during menstrual phase, because sometimes we don't slow down, we don't stop, we push through, and then instead of getting that rise in energy, we end up getting like knocked out in follicular phase, which can feel very disappointing when you're like counting on that return of energy. But what does happen here, if we're honoring that rest and slow down, is with the rise of estrogen, it's connected with serotonin. So serotonin rises with estrogen, and this is why we start to feel a lot more optimistic. We feel more resilient. I like to think of follicular phase and really like estrogen as like the rose-colored glasses. So everything that felt the worst and impossible when you were bleeding, all of a sudden is like, oh, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe I can stay at this job for another month. Maybe I can stay in this relationship. Maybe it's not a big deal. And from an evolutionary perspective, it has a lot of value because this is when we really establish our community and our connections so that we have support when we are in luteal phase, but especially if we get pregnant and we need that additional community support. So that's like where that comes from. But in our modern world, what this can also look like is where we get into people pleasing and self-abandoning because we have all this energy, so we can say yes to everything, we can hold all the things. Whether we can follow through on everything, depending on when the things we say yes to actually falls is a different story. But we really feel like, oh no, I can carry it all. And it doesn't feel like such a burden, so in the moment it seems fine, but it doesn't necessarily serve us, in later phases when we are taking on everyone else's requests, we'll say. So what happens here too is for our metabolism, like we have a lower caloric need because our body is kind of in this pause. It's doing less heavy lifting internally. It's not quite building up the uterine lining yet. It's not shedding. So this is typically when we like, okay, I'm going to start the diet, and it feels so easy. And we're like, oh, this is amazing. I can cut 300 calories a day and not even notice. And we think it's amazing. And then we fall off the wagon in luteal. But the reason for that is because our body genuinely needs less caloric intake as a baseline, and our body thrives on a lower sugar environment at this time as well. So, like I said, like those diets and everything just feel easier. You feel lighter, you feel leaner. Like this is when, we feel good, and we like to take this as the baseline and be like, oh, this is me. This is the version I am. I know that was true for me. I was like, yeah, I'll claim this part of myself. But we do have to see it as it is a cycle, and all the things feed into each other and how we experience them. The other thing that happens with the rise of estrogen is that we can, with all of the sort of like new ideas, new energy, new creativity that comes online, we can also have a very busy mind. And so that can be a challenge for our sleep and for rest, because we just have so many ideas and so many things that we want to do and say yes to. And this can sometimes come up as being a little bit critical, especially if we have a hard time with rest. And so we're thinking like, oh, I'm so behind because menstrual phase kind of knocked me out and I wasn't as productive and I need to like overcompensate. But this is really like new bloom, first blooms of spring type energy, where we really have to nourish it if we want if we want the full effect of it, and we don't want to burn out. And so I think the best way to do that in follicular phase is to prioritize play. So it's not to say don't work, it's like work hard, but also build in play, build in creativity, build in things for yourself, and let those be the boundaries. Let those fun things be the boundaries, because we don't want to say no in follicular. We want to say yes. We want to say yes to everything. So make sure that you're also saying yes to things that restore you, are outlets for creativity, and let that be the boundary for other people's requests and for the work and the family things. All right, and then in ovulatory phase, we have everything at its peak. Well, not progesterone. We have estrogen and testosterone at its peak. This is when we can be feeling our most confident, our most magnetic. Not that everyone feels this, but this is kind of what's considered like, okay, this is peak summer energy. This is when we're really feeling ourselves. And there's so many studies that are just so fascinating of like the types of clothes women will buy when they're ovulating, or the clothes that they choose to wear, because we kind of go into this version of ourselves where we want to be more visible, we want to be seen. We also experience like stronger connections in the left and right hemisphere of our brain. And so our communication is more clear, more effective. So a lot of people who work with this, like in their business, will notice they have higher conversion rates when they have like discovery calls in ovulatory phase than in other phases, things like this, because we're in this magnetic energy and we are primed to like invite people in, and people pick up on that. But this can also, some people also can experience like ovulatory pain here or additional inflammation, because ovulation itself is an inflammatory process. So if you're experiencing discomfort here, this is when reducing inflammation or inflammatory foods can be really helpful for this transition. And also fiber. This is when the raw vegetables, the smoothies, the salads are really helpful, because we're still in that window where we don't need as many calories, so we're not as hungry, but those high fiber foods are going to do a lot to help make sure we don't carry in extra estrogen into our luteal phase and to keep everything moving and flushed out. And here estrogen is still peaking, so we can still kind of have that idea of like a busy brain. But in follicular, it can be a little bit more self-critical, a little like the inner critic voice can be there a little bit more. I feel like in ovulatory, it is more like, I just want all the experiences. So I don't want to go to bed because I want to stay out and be social, and I want to be in all the places and experiencing all the things. And so what's going to help us stay rested, stay restored here is leaning into pleasure. And that can be in obvious ways like orgasms, but it can also be in just like getting into our bodies and exploring sensory experiences. So this can be things like gardening, it can be painting, it can be similar things that we do in follicular, but it really is about like how much more can we get in our body and experience like the sensory aspects of life is going to be really satisfying here. All right. So then when we get to luteal phase, it's actually worth thinking about this as kind of like first half, second half of luteal. So this is one that is very consistent. It's like 12 to, in a healthy regular cycle, it's 12 to 14 days, but for each person, it's going to be an exact day, which I just think is super fascinating, like how predictable the cycle is for something we've been told is so mysterious and so, like we can't know what's going on. Your body specifically is like, once it ovulates, it has a 12 to 14 day countdown to your period, which is just fun to explore. If I get a kick out of that. Not everyone does, but but in the first half of luteal, there is sort of an initial dip after ovulation of all the hormones, so it can be a little bit of a sensitive period initially, especially if you have PMDD, if you're neurodivergent. There can be more sensitivity to that, but most people still feel pretty stable and solid during that first half of luteal, a little bit more focused, maybe a little more like mellow and calm, and that's really the effect of progesterone coming in and soothing the nervous system. But then in the second half, in the premenstrual week, that's when progesterone and estrogen decline, and so that's the start of that buffer dropping off, and the edges sharpen. In our experience, our nervous system is primed to be on a little bit more high alert, to scan for threats a little bit more, because again, in the case of a viable pregnancy, it's a very sensitive window, and so it wants to keep you safe. And again, in our modern world, we're not looking out for, lions and all of those things, but this is when we start to notice like what is sustainable in our life, what's really serving us, what's not. And so a lot can get loud here. But then physically what's happening is our metabolism slows, and this is also really fascinating. It slows so that we can actually get more of the nutrients out of our food. This also happens in pregnancy, and because progesterone gets increases significantly in pregnancy, and that's how we're able to create a baby without needing to eat like double to triple the calories, because our metabolism slows and it's actually extracting more of the nutrients from what we are eating. And so with that, we also have a higher caloric need, because this is when our body's doing that kind of heavy internal lifting of like preparing to shed the uterine lining. And it does thrive on a higher sugar environment. Now, that's not to say go eat all the sugar, but it explains why we tend to have those cravings where we're like, I need the chocolate, I need the chips, I need those quick, carbs to boost that sugar. The other piece that's in here is like with estrogen dropping, so does serotonin. So you have those two things playing on those cravings of like, I want the quick, serotonin hit from the quick carbs and the quick sugar. And also my body does need more calories. So the way that we can really support this is leaning into more complex carbs in this phase, things that are going to be a slower release of that sugar and help sustain blood sugar. And blood sugar regulation here is going to be the biggest thing to support metabolism, but also mood here, because we don't have the estrogen and serotonin helping us stay, like more upbeat, we'll say. But so yeah, balancing our blood sugar is going to help us stay a little bit more stable there. And then when it comes to like rest here, in that first week, we tend to get, when progesterone is high, we get really good deep sleep. When progesterone starts to drop off again, it can be harder to stay in REM sleep. So that's really when we want to plan for our sleep environment. We want to be a little bit more strict about avoiding screens at night, or creating like a wind down routine, making sure the room's cold enough. And these are similar recommendations, right, to perimenopause with hot flashes. It's like, how can you create a sleep environment that's going to support your body staying in that deep sleep for longer. Okay. All right. So now I just want to zoom out really quick and look at the relationship of estrogen and progesterone across the life cycle. Because so often in the conversation of balancing hormones and cycle syncing and like how do you optimize what you're eating and your movement and all these things based on the phase you're in, it's really easy to bring a perfectionistic and kind of hyper-fixated view to the cycle of like, okay, we can control it. And if I get it just right, and if I control it and keep my entire environment perfect, then I won't experience discomfort, or I won't have any of these issues. But something that I feel like this graph really shows is that there are times when imbalance is not a malfunction. It's actually by design. And so it's equally important that we're in relationship to seasons when our hormones are not balanced as it is to like working towards a more balanced cycle. And we see that in the teen years where estrogen, it is an estrogen dominant time as the body is working those hormones production up to like reproductive year levels. And then the same in perimenopause, where it is estrogen dominant. And that is like, if that were happening in the reproductive years, we'd be like, this is a huge hormone imbalance. And it feels that way. But the teen years and perimenopause, they're kind of a mirror, right? Of, you know, the beginning and ending of this cycle. And so we can go back to these times and see, like, what is it that we were missing? Like in our teen years, were we missing education? Were we missing community? You know, what was it that would have been supportive in those years, and how can we glean from that to help support us in this, like, the transition on the other end? The other thing is, even in our reproductive years, there is a lot of normal things that can disrupt the cycle. The biggest ones being pregnancy and postpartum are imbalances, at least compared to like a consistent, you know, regular cycle, but also things like travel can delay or eliminate ovulation for a cycle. Getting sick, there's various things that can do that, and our bodies are very flexible and they're very resilient. So I think it's important that we also understand that relationship to imbalance and how those things are actually, there's lessons to be learned in that as well that support us long term, and how, you know, in these reproductive years, luteal phase has very similar qualities to stages of perimenopause. And so these are sort of like these micro moments that help us through those later transitions when we're able to build up that relationship of support, and just understanding understanding ourselves in that phase. And I think this really helps us understand when to bring in intervention and when to honor the season that we're in. Because I think both can be necessary, where sometimes we're so hyperfixated on like fixing and healing and getting everything better, and some of it is an initiation in like the spiritual experience, or it can be, if you choose that, where you are letting like what no longer is meant to go with you into the next season of life, like actually kind of burn away, and as you transition through that. But I also want to take a moment here to name that like we've inherited this burden of having like more complex sensitive systems that are more sensitive to our environment, especially with all of the microplastics and the xenoestrogens and all this exposure. Like it does impact our bodies more than it does the male body. We also have this burden of dealing with like such imbalanced power dynamics socially, especially for women of color. But it's like we've inherited all of that, but we haven't really been given and initiated into the power of our cycles, of our feminine energy. And I think this is what gets me excited, is this piece of like, yes, let's get the education, but I care that you know about that, because I really believe these are entry points and portals to really reclaiming your connection to self. Because we haven't been taught how to wield that power, and usually when we do, it's called manipulation, you know, and it's really villainized when women are in their power. And I think it can show up in different ways, right? We can experience this power that we don't quite know how to direct as chaos, and that can show up as chaos in the body and our symptoms, but also in our relationships, especially when we have these different versions of ourselves, and then it gets labeled as like, oh, we're being so crazy, or we're being hormonal, or, you know, we have all these labels for the feminine expression. It can also look like burnout, because we have all of this life force energy, and it very easily, especially in how our systems are constructed, can be siphoned off to serve everyone else's purposes without really not being conscious. And it's not always malicious, right? Like our kids aren't maliciously like, I'm going to use up all the energy when they're just constantly asking. But if we're not in conscious relationship with our energy levels and when and where we need boundaries and how that ebbs and flows, we can just be giving it all away. And I really believe that like life will initiate us, and it initiates us at different times and in, different forms that comes in. But I do think that how painful or chaotic or disruptive those initiations are has so much to do with your relationship with yourself and your agency and your power. And so I want to walk us back through those 4 phases a little more quickly this time, but looking at that like deeper layer of what we can really tap into in each of these phases. So when we're in menstrual phase, we talked about how our reproductive hormones are at their lowest, and this actually gives rise to a lot of intuitive clarity, because what I also see here is as those buffers lower, which we talked about estrogen being about establishing our belonging in community and having that support system and being in society. But when those are low, I really think this also lowers the buffer between our conditioned self and our authentic self. And so I think that we are able to then tap into what's so true for us in this phase that's just so much easier to tap into than in others. And this is also why it's so important for us to slow down. Because if we're pushing past this and rushing through this and not creating that space, then we don't hear and the nudges of like, this isn't true, this isn't right, you're making choices, you're moving forward in ways that aren't going to serve you. And when we do that cycle after cycle, we tend to have these bigger initiations that are like dark night of the soul and like our life blowing up in some way because we've just been ignoring that voice for so long or haven't known how to really listen to it or tap into it. And it's not to say that this is the only time that we hear our intuition. It's just that because that conditioning is lower, it is much easier to tap into it, and it's much easier to learn how it shows up for you and the quality of it. So great journal practices here is like really sitting with, how does my intuition speak to me? Is it a felt sense in the body? Is it like a mental insight that hits? Is it like synchronicities and, things that you connect in your environment? Because the more that you can understand the quality of that, the easier it will be to recognize it in those other, parts of your life and other phases. And then, I skipped one. Okay, in follicular. Here the idea is, that I kind of mentioned this before, this is inner spring. So this is this first bloom of energy, and it's so important that we protect it. And playing is a way that we allow this energy to support us first so that we're giving from an overflow. And so many times when we're talking about burnout, people first go to luteal phase as like that being the issue and how we're showing up in luteal. But luteal is where we feel the consequences. It's not where we lay the foundation for that. I truly believe that we lay the foundation in follicular. If we're going hard and overachieving and not creating the space for play and joy, we are setting the bar so high for ourselves of what's expected, and we create even a bigger gap in capacity between what we accomplish in follicular and what we accomplish in luteal and what matters. And so really thinking about that idea of like, we talk so much about you can't pour from an empty cup. And this is that phase where we really want to lean into filling our cup so that when we move into ovulatory phase and we have more energy, we can then give from that overflow. And then in ovulatory, we're magnetic AF. And it's not about chasing. It's being so magnetic that what you want can't help but find you. And this is not passive. And I think the greatest example of this is that this is so deeply reflected in our biology. And I know growing up, this story I always heard around this is like survival of the fittest, the fastest swimmer, like the sperm. The whole story is about the sperm. But sperm are not actually very intelligent cells. And if you think about it, the female reproductive system is kind of a death trap. I don't know if you know this, but vaginas have pockets. There's like little like pockets, caverns like along the side, and a ton, sperm gets trapped and stuck and they can't find their way out. And then we have so much of the cycle where There is not like very lubricated cervical fluid, and like especially in like luteal phase where progesterone dries it up, so it's like that more sticky, tacky texture, which is also like, nope, you're not getting through this, you're not getting past this. So there's all these like real obstacles in the way. And at the same time, the egg is not just passive, the egg is sending out electrical pulses that is actually attracting which sperm that it's going to let in, and it's selective. It's not the first one that arrives. The egg is making the choice, and this is manifestation energy. And this is something that we can really tap into here and feel into, like, how does desire, how does longing show up for us in what we want our life to look like. And because we have the communication here as well, again, it's this time where we get to invite people into that vision. We get to invite people in for support, for connection, for intimacy, like all of these different ways. And so it can be such a powerful little window to kind of tap into that magnetic energy that we have. And then luteal phase. I feel like luteal gets such a bad rap. But this phase is really about not letting you self-abandon. That's what luteal is here for. It's going to tell you the things that have not been working the whole time, but it's going to get loud and tell you, no, this is actually not sustainable. And the reason it's loud is usually because we didn't pick up on the subtle signals of the other phases. Because this is something I've experienced and seen with others as well, is that the more that you build that relationship with the other phases, and you can hear your intuition in menstrual phase, and you're exploring your ideas in follicular, and you're inviting people in ovulatory, but you're leading that from that, like, and the insights from menstrual phase, right? The authentic self, that's what's guiding those decisions. Luteal doesn't have to be so loud because you're listening. But when we aren't, this is where we see our body say, like, no, we can't do this. We won't do this. Good luck. And so it's really revealing what is not serving us, what needs to change. And it's not always, there's a lot of intensity here often, but it doesn't always mean crisis. It doesn't always mean like you have to end a relationship or you have to quit your job, even if that's what it feels like. Being in relationship with this phase is saying, like, okay, what about this relationship is not serving? What about the dynamic is not working? With a job, like, what about it is causing the friction? What about it is unsustainable? And that may lead us to having, meaningful conversations to shift the dynamic. It may lead to endings in various ways, but it's not just, I feel like what I most want you to take from this is, like, I hear so often that, like, oh, I don't make big decisions in luteal. And I get that, and I get where that comes from, of, like, I don't want to make decisions from a reactive place. And that I completely agree with. Like, if it's feeling very reactive and you don't want to just, like, blow your life up on, like, oh, actually, I needed a snack. Because that does happen sometimes, which we don't want to hear, but sometimes it's like our blood sugar was low, we're reactive, and we're just, making decisions. But there's so much deep information here about what you really need. It's like the truth teller. And so being in relation to that and then using that energy to respond from a conscious place can be really, really powerful. And sometimes we need that energy to have those conversations. Sometimes we can't have them in follicular because we're too like, oh, I guess that's fine. We're a little too passive. Sometimes we need that extra oomph behind those conversations to express the severity of it and how much that boundary really matters to you. And so ultimately, luteal is not the villain of the cycle. She's just here to protect you and to not let you abandon yourself. And it's also this room, like, on a more, like, spiritual lens of, like, this is shadow territory. This is where we can see some of that conditioning get really loud. This is where we can see, like, the edges of what our nervous system is comfortable with. And so it's really a powerful time to lean into, like, okay, what is reactive versus, like, my deep truth? What is, I'm afraid to do this thing, or I'm afraid to lean into this feeling, or this is my nervous system showing me that this is no longer an environment I want to be in, you know. And so we get to kind of go on those nuances if we're willing to be present to that tension. And so ultimately, you know, there is this like deeper layer of embodiment that's possible when we go down this road with the cycle. And it's really about, like, my goal is always to help you build a relationship with yourself that travels across each phase, each season of life, and every initiation. And that's really what my work is built around. And I have started, like, when I first started coaching, it was very much like the typical format, like weekly calls. But I found really quickly that this type of work, this type of rewiring, like, isn't happening on a call, right? In this snapshot of what phase are you in and what feels true today. It really happens in the moments of the micro moments of activation that happen. And so how I work now is primarily voice and text coaching to really meet people in the activation, in that present moment where all that energy is and where we can actually practice the pauses and the rewiring and the pivots and the shifts in somewhat real time. Because I think that really allows us to do this integration work in a different way. Because yes, we can set an intention and we can be like, this month we're focused on this, but how each version of you relates to that area of life or that situation is going to be so different. And so by not feeling like, oh, well, I have a call in a week, and you're trying to hang on to the situation. So I find that there's so much transformation that can happen in those micro moments. So that's how I like to work.
I agree.
I do have a link for, I've opened a few free coaching days for people to experience firsthand that voice and text coaching, and I'll send you the link so you can send that out with the replay. But
I think it's great. I think that you hit a really pivotal thing, that when we meet weekly and there's nothing to support that nervous system in those moments of triggers, we don't get that rewiring that we're wanting to get to because there's no support.
Okay. Yeah. Hold on, sorry. I'm trying, like, how do I get off of share? Okay, there we go. It was on a different screen. Okay. Can you see me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Awesome.
But yes, I do believe that having that kind of support really is so essential to the nervous system. It's life changing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still meet with people on a weekly basis, or it's just voice and text?
So I usually do one call a month where we kind of set those in. We gather context, we set the intention, we talk about any education that is relevant or helpful. But then it's like, let's work with it in real life. Let's go to those moments. And yeah, that's been honestly my favorite way to work too.
Yeah, it sounds really, really good. Really supportive, really juicy, especially in the moment. My next question for you is, how young are the young women that you're working with?
So I have primarily worked with women, I would say mostly in their like late 20s to like mid 30s has been most of my clients. I'm currently starting conversations with the local community center about doing a like workshop series for teens to bring just that education earlier and just support these girls so that they know what's going on. And obviously the education's not happening in school and parents don't know. And I'm on the PTO board at my kids' school, and there's some moms in there with older girls, and they're like, we're trying to do the research, we're trying to help, we care. Right. But also, feel so limited when they don't have that experience themselves. So
well, and we were talking about just we're not normalizing conversations like these early enough, and so it makes it very challenging both for the parent and for the child, and especially once they're in school and they have all of this influence, or they have all of this misinformation, or kids are already making fun of things, and so they're uncomfortable. So I think really being able to talk to them early is such a huge, it's a big step forward.
Yeah, and if there's moms who are thinking about it from that perspective of like, how do I help my daughters through it. Like would love to connect on that as well, of like having some informational workshops, or like kind of with that focus of like, how do we have these conversations? How do we talk about it? And how do we introduce, this because I think that's a big part where it feels so scary to start when you didn't have that modeled.
Right, right. And I think that's where we get stuck, is that we don't know where to go for this information. And just to me, the slide with life cycles is amazing to be able to see where we're at and what's happening to us, because nobody shares that with us. And a gynecologist is not a hormone specialist, but that's where they send us.
Yeah.
And then if you go to the endocrinologist is so general too. It's hard.
Yeah, it does fall through the cracks where it's like no one quite takes ownership of it, and it's challenging when I think that's because that narrative has been so like siloed, like, oh, reproductive hormones are ovary,
Right.
uterus territory.
And
But
it-
it's
and
not. It's so present, and we have more research showing that, of like, we have so many estrogen receptors in our brain, and that's why perimenopause is so challenging. And
Right.
even just the understanding that there's different types of estrogen, like there's 3 different forms, and that's what's happening in perimenopause, is the primary form of estrogen is shifting, and that other form also, like, just a fact that I am like, oh, like, how many women feel so bad about like the little extra weight they gain or that they can't quite let go of, but fat produces estrogen. And so during those transitions, some of that we hang on to is such a protective measure to help us through that transition. And yeah, just that's where like that acceptance piece of like, yes, like, eat healthy, yes, get the labs and like support your body, and also it's an opportunity to really just like love this version of yourself and what she's going through, and appreciate it.
Yeah, well, we don't have that information,
Yeah.
we don't have enough support around this. I was going to ask you something else too. When a woman is on HRT, do those levels continue to go into a cycle, or are they more consistent because they're being received orally or a patch?
Yeah, so with that, it depends, because people can be on that past, like, when they're fully done cycling, like they can still be on hormones, right? And so in that case, if the actual cycle has fully stopped, then any hormone level you have is directly tied to the HRT, like what you're taking. But in that transition, like, some people can still be ovulating, so they can still be producing their own hormones alongside of it. I just saw something today about how, like, you can still be having a bleed, and it can be like, well, is this a true period because I ovulated and then this is the result of that? Or am I on hormone replacement things where, like, then estrogen is still present and thickening the lining, and so then at some point it sheds, and so, the bleeding still happens, but it's not, like a true period, so to speak.
Okay.
So both of those things can be present. If you really want to, like, know what's going on with your body, tracking your cycle can be really helpful. In that scenario, doing basal body temperature, like taking your temperature every day to see if you get that mid-cycle spike showing that ovulation occurred, would give you that type of information. Or you could do like the ovulation strips, like if you really want to know,
Right.
get that hands-on data. Yeah, but it's very fascinating, because when you start to mix all of these pieces together, it can also create a more complex picture of what's happening.
Yeah, yeah, especially when it's a medically induced menopause.
Yeah.
It just, so many questions around it because we don't have enough information or awareness.
Yeah, and I think there's also, I want to name this as well, because I know a lot of women seek out hormone replacement because they're like, I'm having all these symptoms and like I need help, I need support. But there's also, I think, a group of women that are like, oh, well, I've hit a certain age, I should get my hormone tested, I should go on hormonal therapy, because that's what you do when you're of a certain age. I had this conversation with my mom, because, like I said, she didn't have really intense periods, and perimenopause wasn't very intense for her. And I told her, I was like, if you're not feeling that bad, like, you don't need to be on hormones.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're supposed to drop off. Like, menopause is a normal, it's not a pathology. It's not something that's happening to you. This is a normal part of, like, the female life cycle. And so it's not just by default that you need to get hormones. It's really, like, if your symptoms are really disruptive, if you're really struggling, or, and it's not something that you feel like you're handling well, like, these things can come in and support you. But I also want to, like, speak to that piece of it too, where it just feels like, oh, this is what you do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think it is what you do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many women with Alzheimer's and dementia, because, these hormones are protective.
Yeah.
So when I look at it from that lens of the protective space, I feel like it really, it does you so much more benefit when it's tied into so many different issues, like your heart. It protects your brain, your heart, your metabolism. So many women go insulin resistant because of these hormones going cray cray.
Yeah.
So to me, it helps normalize these things versus pressuring your heart, pressuring your blood pressure, eating your muscle and your bones. Like, it's so important to have this, like, looking at it from a very holistic perspective on
Yeah, absolutely.
what this HRT does is more than just pump hormones into you.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm saying this because my mother has osteoporosis because of that low estrogen. And she had continual urinary tract infections because of lack of estrogen.
Yeah.
And more women die of urinary tract infections than anything else. So it's also, being able to have more information and not create shame around the women who want to have that support. Because, I mean, obviously I vote for more bioidentical, but I recognize that not everyone has the funds to support
Yeah.
it. And that's the sad part. We don't have, our regular pharmacies don't give us that. There are countries in this world that don't support any of it. And then there are countries in this world that give you a supply with just coming and seeing them twice a year.
Yeah.
So I think it just really depends on the lens. And I just think that if you can get thyroid hormone for your underactive thyroid, you should be able to get hormones for anything in your body.
Yeah. Yeah, and this comes back to what we talked about, of, like, that protective nature, right, of those reproductive years too. Because, like, if you spent those years on birth control too, like, or if you've
Absolutely.
had endometriosis, or you've had these more, like, extreme experiences of your cycle, you're coming to that conversation from a much different place. So, like I mentioned, my mom, she's never been on the pill her entire life. She's had regular cycles, minimal disruption. Like, she got a little teary sometimes and would come ask us for chocolate. Like,
We hate
and not
her.
to just, like, I'm like, amazing, you had your unicorn experience, whatever.
Yeah,
but
I
for
think that's
her,
amazing.
she was, like, not even coming from a symptom. She was just like, oh, I guess I'm this age. Like, I guess I should do that. And I was like, I mean,
Well, I
not
mean,
and so that's a
has-
very different entrance to the conversation, right?
like making sure her bone density as well, like all of these different things. But to your point, yes, when children are active, and this is really the reason why we want our children to be so active young, because they're building that bone density, they're building that muscle memory.
And that is a challenge with the pill that I don't think is talked about enough from just, like, an informed consent perspective, because it does impact that early development of bone density. And so, like, when it is being prescribed young and for, that kind of first line for acne and, those types of things, or to just, like, oh, you periods are painful, here, go on this, without looking at, where is that coming from. And we looked at the life cycle chart, right, where, like, those initial periods for teens, there is some level of estrogen dominance, and, like, they may experience a little bit more discomfort as their hormones are revving up.
Yeah.
But yeah, just, like, jumping in immediately with turning off that cycle, it does, it impacts so many like the system holistically. It's not just
Yeah.
reproduction.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. I think it impacts later in life. And so that baseline really makes us think twice, and that baseline needs to be pushed into the teen years to be more aware. Yeah, I think this is a lot of great information, and I just thank you for being here and doing such great work. And I think, if you don't mind, I think I'm gonna go ahead and redistribute this video because I think more women need to be more curious about it,
Yeah.
ask more questions, and definitely create more of a community around this kind of information. Back in the day, probably about 13 years ago, we became part of a red tent, my daughter and I.
Yeah.
And every month we would go, and the women were there supporting other women, asking in real time, what is it that you need? Because everyone would sit in a circle, and so you just turn around and you're like, oh, I need my shoulders rubbed. And it was like so yummy to be
Yeah.
able to get a shoulder rub on the new moon where a lot of women were cycling at the same time. So I wish that we could have that kind of safe space where we could have our own little red tent, and have the crones come and make
Yeah.
that yummy soup and take care of you when you're so exhausted. And I realize that so many executive women in leadership don't quit
Yeah.
because they can't do it. They quit because the system does not support these cycles.
Yeah, and they're not prepared. They're like, no, they've reached these high levels and at such like a level of capacity and consistency, like they know how to show up.
Yeah.
And then it's a completely different version
Yeah.
of self. And yeah, it's
Well, they
really
treat us-
challenging to
they treat
navigate
us like
alone.
men.
Yeah.
They treat us like men.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brianna. I really appreciate you being here. And I will go ahead and send everyone your Instagram. Is that the best place that you want to be followed?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll send you the other link to work with me as well and stuff so you can send it out.
Absolutely. Let
Amazing.
me
Thank
end
you.
it here. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. If you have any questions, hit reply at the end of the email, and please contact Brianna directly for any of your questions.